The sun hung low over the Arkansas hills, painting the Treadwell farm in strokes of amber and shadow. Elias Treadwell wiped sweat from his brow, his calloused hands gripping the axe handle as he split another log. At 42, he was a man built from the red clay of the Ozarks, broad-shouldered, with a beard streaked gray like the smoke from his chimney. The farm wasn't much: a sagging cabin, a barn leaning against the wind, fields that yielded just enough corn and tobacco to keep hunger at bay. But it was theirs, carved from wilderness after the war had spit him out broken but alive. Inside the cabin, his wife, Clara, knelt by the hearth, stirring a pot of beans that simmered with the last of the salt pork. Her hair, once the color of ripe wheat, was pulled back tight, and her eyes, sharp and watchful, flicked toward the window every few moments. At 38, Clara had the quiet strength of someone who'd buried a child and kept planting in the spring. "Boys'll be back soon," she murmured to herself, though the words were more prayer than prediction. The twins, Jacob and Josiah, had taken the mule cart to the river that morning, hunting for fish or whatever the waters might give up. They were 14 now, lanky shadows of their father, with Elias's dark eyes and her own stubborn jaw. The door creaked open before Elias could set down the axe, and the twins tumbled in, their boots muddy from the path. Jacob led, always the bolder one, his grin flashing white against sun-browned skin as he hefted a string of catfish. "Look what we snagged, Pa. River's full today." Josiah followed, quieter, carrying the empty creel, his gaze already drifting to the corners of the room as if checking for ghosts. He was the cautious twin, the one who paused before crossing a creek, who whispered warnings about owls calling at noon. Elias ruffled Jacob's hair, the boy ducking with a laugh. "Good haul. Clean 'em out back, and we'll have supper worth remembering." Clara straightened, her smile softening the lines around her mouth. She portioned out the beans, the steam rising like a veil between them. As the family gathered at the rough-hewn table, the light outside faded, pulling long shadows across the floorboards. Jacob chattered about the river's bend, how the water had swirled darker than usual, pulling at their lines like hands from below. Josiah ate in silence, his fork scraping softly, but his eyes caught on the window where the dusk pressed in. That night, after the fire had died to embers, Elias lay awake beside Clara. The cabin settled with creaks that mimicked footsteps, and outside, the wind whispered through the pines. He thought of the letters from town, rumors of fever moving up from the Delta, or worse, whispers of men with grudges from the old feuds. But it was the land itself that troubled him most, this stretch of Arkansas where the soil clung like blood and the hills hid their secrets. Clara shifted, her hand finding his. "They're growing too fast," she said softly. "Shadows longer than the boys themselves." Elias nodded into the dark, but sleep evaded him. In the next room, the twins shared a pallet, their breath steady. Yet as the moon climbed, a chill seeped through the walls, and Elias swore he heard it, a faint padding, like bare feet on the dirt path outside. He rose, peering through the warped glass. The yard lay empty, but the shadows from the trees stretched unnaturally far, twisting toward the cabin door as if beckoning. He shook his head, blaming the whiskey from supper, and returned to bed. Still, the sound lingered in his mind, soft and insistent, like something small and unseen circling the home they had fought to claim. Elias Treadwell wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his calloused hand, the late afternoon sun hanging low like a bruised peach over the Arkansas hills. The air hummed with cicadas, thick and unrelenting, but it was the silence from the barn that gnawed at him. Jacob had been out there since dawn, hammering away at the loose boards on the roof, his 14-year-old frame all sinew and determination. Now nothing. Elias glanced at the horizon, where the tree line bled into shadow, earlier than it should have. He called out, voice rough from the dust. "Jacob, you finish up in there?" No answer, just the faint creak of wind against the eaves. Mary was inside, tending to Tommy, who'd been feverish all morning, his small body slick with sweat despite the cool cloths she pressed to his forehead. Elias didn't like leaving her alone with a boy like that, not with the whispers from the neighbors about sickness creeping in from the river bottoms. But the farm demanded it, always did. Pushing open the barn door, Elias stepped into the dim interior, the scent of hay and manure hitting him like a wall. Tools lay scattered on the dirt floor, the hammer abandoned mid-swing beside a half-repaired beam.
Boy!
His boots crunched over straw as he moved deeper, eyes adjusting to the gloom. A single ray of light slanted through a crack in the wall, catching dust motes in its path. And there, on the far wall, a shadow stretched long and wrong, taller than Jacob, thinner, its edges flickering as if breathing. Elias froze, heart thudding against his ribs. It wasn't the boys. He'd seen shadows his whole life, cast by lanterns and campfires, but this one moved on its own, a subtle shift, like fingers curling in the dark. Jacob! The shout echoed, unanswered. He lunged forward, grabbing the hammer from the floor, its weight grounding him. The shadow recoiled, melting into the corner as if startled, and then Jacob's voice came from the loft above, muffled and strained.
Pa?
That you? The boy's face appeared over the edge, pale under his mop of brown hair, eyes wide. He climbed down the ladder with hurried steps, nearly slipping on the last rung. I was just restin' a spell. Roof's done, but something fell off up there. Elias pulled him close, scanning the barn again. The shadow was gone now, just ordinary gloom pooling in the corners. But the chill lingered, settling in his bones. What did you see, son? Up in the loft. Jacob hesitated, glancing toward the spot where the light had pierced. Nothin' clear, Pa. Just my shadow. It didn't match. Like it was walkin' ahead of me. Wait. He rubbed his arms, as if brushing off invisible cobwebs. Elias nodded, not pressing, though the words twisted in his gut. The boy was brave, always had been. First to chase off coyotes or mend a fence in the rain, but this was different, a fear that didn't show in trembling hands. They stepped out into the yard together, the sun dipping lower, painting the fields in gold and lengthening every cast outline. Tommy's cries filtered from the house, faint but insistent, and Mary's voice soothed him in reply. Elias clapped Jacob on the shoulder. Go wash up. Supper soon. We'll talk more inside. But as they walked, Elias couldn't shake the image, that shadow, ahead, beckoning. Inside, the kitchen was a haven of warmth, the hearth fire crackling low. Mary looked up from the table, her apron dusted with flour, dark hair pinned back, but escaping in wisps. She was the steady one, cautious where Elias charged ahead, her eyes sharp for trouble before it broke. You're late, she said, though her tone held no real bite. She ladled stew into bowls, the steam rising like ghosts in the lamplight. Tommy sat propped in a chair, his 7-year-old face flushed, a rag draped over his lap. He managed a weak smile for Jacob, who ruffled his brother's hair. Feelin' better, little man? A bit, Tommy whispered, but his gaze drifted to the window, where the first twilight shadows stretched across the porch. Elias watched him, noting the way the boy's small shadow on the wall seemed to twitch, separate from his movements, as if listening to the conversation. They ate in near silence, the clink of spoons the only rhythm. Outside, the cicadas swelled, then fell quiet, an unnatural hush falling over the farm. Elias set down his bowl. Jacob saw something in the barn today. Shadows actin' peculiar. Mary's spoon paused midway to her mouth. Peculiar how? Her voice was even, but her free hand tightened on Tommy's shoulder. Like they got a mind of their own, Jacob said, pushing peas around his plate. Mine moved first. Pa led me up to the loft, almost like it wanted me to see something. Tommy shifted, his eyes darting. Mine does too. At night, when I wake up, it's longer. Stands by the door. The room grew still, the fire popping softly. Elias exchanged a look with Mary, worry etching deeper lines around her eyes. They'd come to this land 5 years back, chasing promises of fertile soil and freedom from the crowded East, but Arkansas held its secrets. Old tales from the trappers spoke of shadows that wandered after dark, echoes of the Cherokee who'd been driven out, their spirits clinging to the earth. Elias had dismissed them as Elias Treadwell wiped the sweat from his brow, the midday sun beating down on the splintered porch like a hammer on anvil iron. The farm stretched out before him, rows of cornstalks whispering in the dry wind, but his eyes fixed on the treeline where the shadows had lingered longest that morning. Jacob had seen them first, tall, wavering shapes that moved against the light, not quite human, not quite echo. Like us, but ahead, the boy had said, his voice steady, but his fists clenched white on the axe handle. Inside, Clara knelt by the hearth, stirring a pot of thin stew, her movements precise as always, though her shoulders carried the weight of unspoken fears. Thomas hovered near the door, peering out the grimy window, his cautious nature keeping him one step from whatever stalked their land. "Pa's coming back from the well," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "He'll know what to do." The door creaked open, and Elias stepped in, bucket sloshing with precious water. He set it down with a thud, his face etched deeper than the Arkansas riverbeds. "Nothing in the well but mud and echoes," he said, voice low. Heard it again, footsteps, like boots on dry leaves, but the wind was still. Clara looked up, her eyes sharp, the wooden spoon pausing mid-stir. "The boy's shadows," she said, not a question. It had started a week ago, after the fever took the neighbor's child, shadows detaching at dusk, slipping into the woods like scouts on a midnight raid. Jacob burst in from the back, dirt-streaked and breathless, his brave streak pushing him farther than sense allowed. "Pa, they're moving again. Out by the old oak, the ones that look like me and Tom." Thomas flinched, stepping back into the room's dim corner. "We shouldn't go near. Last time the chickens." He trailed off, remembering the feathers scattered like bloody confetti, no bodies to be found. Elias straightened, his calloused hand resting on the rifle propped by the door. "We face it together. No running from what's ours." The family gathered close, the air thick with the scent of simmering cornmeal and the faint, acrid tang of fear. Outside, the shadows stretched longer as clouds scudded across the sun, pulling ahead like impatient ghosts. They stepped out as one, the porch boards groaning under their boots. The farmyard was quiet, save for the distant call of a mockingbird mimicking a cry. Jacob led, axe in hand, his steps bold but measured, while Thomas flanked Clara, his eyes darting to every flicker in the grass. Elias brought up the rear, rifle at the ready, the weight of protection settling on him like an ill-fitted yoke. The old oak loomed at the field's edge, its branches gnarled like arthritic fingers clawing at the sky. There, beneath it, the shadows waited, not cast by any living thing, but standing alone, elongated forms that twisted when the wind sighed through the leaves. One mimicked Jacob's lanky build, the other Thomas's slighter frame, both facing away, as if beckoning into the deeper woods. "Call to Elias whispered, his voice rough as gravel. Jacob hesitated, then cupped his hands. "Hey, what are you?" The shadows stirred, rippling like water disturbed by a stone. No sound came, but the air grew colder, a chill that seeped through cotton shirts and raised gooseflesh on bare arms. Clara gripped Thomas's shoulder, her cautious whisper cutting the tension. "They're pulling us in, like the river current, slow at first, then gone." The boy nodded, his wits surfacing in a shaky quip. "Maybe they're just lazy, walking ahead, so we don't have to." But his laugh died quick, as the shadows began to glide forward, deeper into the underbrush. Elias raised the rifle, sighting down the barrel, but Jacob grabbed his arm. "Wait, shooting echoes won't stop, Em." The family pressed on, the shadows leading like silent hounds, the woods swallowing the sunlight in greedy gulps. Twigs snapped underfoot, not theirs, but something else's, faint, rhythmic, always a beat ahead. Deeper in, the air thickened with the rot of fallen leaves and something sharper, like ozone before a storm. The shadows paused at a clearing, ringed by ferns heavy with dew despite the heat. In the center, a depression in the earth, like a fresh-dug grave, too small for a man but wide enough for secrets. Jacob knelt, peering in, his bravery teetering on recklessness. "There's writing, scratched in the dirt. Names. Ours." Thomas leaned close, his voice a hushed tremble. "And dates. After tomorrow." Clara crossed herself, old habits from her Kentucky roots, while Elias scanned the trees, the rifle's stock slick with sweat. The shadows encircled the pit now, merging at the edges, forming a single, looming shape that whispered, "No," rustled, like dry paper turning in the wind. "We fill it," Elias decided, grabbing a fallen branch to probe the soil. But as he thrust it down, the ground gave way, a soft sucking sound rising, and the branch vanished into darkness. The shadows laughed, or seemed to, a chorus of wind through hollow reeds. Jacob pulled back, face pale. "It's hungry, Pa. For us." They retreated then, the woods pressing close, branches snagging at sleeves like insistent fingers. Back at the farm's edge, the shadows peeled away, reattaching to their owners as the sun dipped lower. But the chill lingered, and in the pit's memory, the dates burned like brands. Elias Treadwell wiped the sweat from his brow, the midday sun beating down on the cotton fields like a forge hammer. The air hung thick with the scent of turned earth and wilting blooms, but it was the unnatural chill that prickled his skin now, seeping from the shadows cast by the gnarled oaks lining the property. He paused, hoe in hand, and glanced toward the house where his wife, Clara, had retreated after breakfast, her face pale as new milk. The boys, Thomas and young Micah, were supposed to be helping with the rows, but Elias hadn't seen their bent forms since dawn. A knot tightened in his gut, the same one that had been growing since the whispers started in the hollows last week. He straightened, shielding his eyes against the glare. There, at the edge of the field, a shape flickered, too long, too thin, like a silhouette stretched by dying light. Elias blinked hard, blaming the heat, but it lingered, mimicking the stride of a man walking just out of sight. "Boys," he called, voice rough from disuse. No answer came, only the rustle of leaves that sounded too much like muffled laughter. He dropped the hoe and started toward it, boots sinking into the soft soil, each step pulling him deeper into the unease that had settled over the farm like fog. Clara was in the kitchen when he burst through the door, her hands buried in a basin of dough, knuckles white. "Elias, what's got you stormin' in like a twister?" She didn't look up, but her shoulders tensed, as if she'd been waiting for this interruption. "The shadows," he said, breathless. "Out there again. Move in without the boys." He crossed to the window, peering out at the empty yard. Nothing now, just the ordinary play of sun and shade on the porch. But he knew better. He'd seen it twice before, once near the barn when Micah had vanished for an hour, returning with mud caked to his shoes and a vacant stare. Clara's hands stilled, flour dusting the air like ghosts. "It's just the light, Elias. The solstice comin' on makes everything twist." Her voice held that careful lilt, the one she used when she didn't quite believe herself. But her eyes, when they met his, were shadowed with the same fear that had kept her from the fields all morning. Last night, she'd confessed the dreams, the boys' forms walking ahead into the woods, their laughter echoing back without warmth. He wanted to argue, to shake sense into the both of them, but the memory of his own father's tales silenced him, old Cherokee warnings about spirits that borrowed the shapes of the living, luring families into the river's embrace. Elias had dismissed them as boys' frights, but now, with the war drums beating faint in the distance and the land feeling smaller each day, those stories clawed their way back. A shout pierced the quiet, Thomas's voice, sharp and boyish, from the direction of the creek. Elias was out the door before Clara could call him back, his heart pounding against his ribs. The path wound through knee-high grass, the shadows here denser, pooling under the branches like spilled ink. He pushed on, calling their names, the air growing cooler with every stride until his breath fogged faintly. At the creek's edge, Thomas knelt by the water, skipping stones with a ferocity that belied his 10 years. Micah sat nearby, legs dangling over the bank, but his gaze was fixed upstream, unblinking. "Pa," Thomas said, not turning. We saw 'em again. The walkers. Elias knelt beside them, scanning the opposite bank where the willows dipped their branches like fingers into the current. No one there, but the water seemed to murmur, carrying echoes of footsteps on the far side. What did they look like, son? Thomas hurled another stone, watching it sink without a ripple. Like us. But ahead. Logan, without mouths. Micah nodded slowly, his small hand clutching a twisted root he'd pulled from the mud, as if it anchored him. The sun dipped lower, stretching the shadows across the creek until they merged with the water's dark flow. Elias felt it then, a pull, gentle as a hand on his shoulder, urging him to follow. He resisted, hauling the boys to their feet. We go back. Now. But as they turned, the shadows ahead twisted once more, outlining forms that matched their own, stepping into the woods without a backward glance. Back at the house, Clara waited with lanterns lit early, the flames glow casting jittery patterns on the walls. They ate in silence that evening, the boys picking at their cornbread while Elias recounted the sighting. Clara's fork trembled as she pushed peas around her plate. We can't keep pretendin' it's nothin'. The preacher in town, he might know something about these solstice spirits. Elias nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. The nearest town was a half-day's ride, and with the roads crawling with talk of secession and strangers passing through, leaving the farm felt like tempting fate. But as night fell, the house creaked under an unseen weight, and from the boys' room came soft footsteps, not theirs, pacing the hall ahead of any waking. He lay awake beside Clara, listening to the rhythm of those steps fading toward the door. Outside, the shadows walked the yard, leading the way into whatever darkness awaited. His hands, calloused and stained from years of tilling this unforgiving Arkansas soil, gripped the hoe tighter than necessary. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something sharper, decay, perhaps, carried on the breeze from the nearby bayou. He glanced over his shoulder at the house, its weathered clapboards sagging under the weight of isolation, and wondered again if leaving the boys alone had been wise. Inside, young Thomas crouched by the hearth, his fingers tracing the faint scorch marks on the stone floor. The fire had gone out hours ago, but the shadows lingered, pooling in the corners like spilled ink. It moved again, he whispered to no one, his voice barely cutting through the silence. At 12, Thomas was the cautious one, always watching, always questioning. His brother Caleb, 2 years older and built like a sapling whipcord, paced the room with restless energy. Shadows don't move on their own, Tom. You're seeing things 'cause Pa's been filling your head with ghost stories from the war. But Thomas shook his head, his eyes wide and unblinking. Last night, after the storm had rattled the shutters, he'd woken to find Caleb's shadow stretching across the wall, tall and thin, but with arms that reached farther than any boy could. It had waved, or so it seemed, a slow, deliberate motion that mocked the rhythm of their breathing. Now, in the stark light filtering through the lace curtains their mother had sewn before the fever took her, Thomas pointed to the floor. Look there, by the table leg. It's not following the light. Caleb stopped pacing, his bravado cracking just a fraction. He squinted at the spot, where a dark smudge clung stubbornly, defying the sun's arc. The plan they'd hatched that morning, to burn sage from the garden and recite the prayers Pa muttered over the crops, felt foolish now, childish. They'd lit the bundle earlier, the acrid smoke curling up to the rafters, but the shadows only seemed to deepen, as if feeding on the effort. Maybe we wait for Pa, Caleb said, though his voice lacked conviction. Outside, the cicadas droned on, relentless chorus that masked the subtle creak of floorboards settling, or shifting under unseen weight. Elias paused in the field, leaning on his hoe as a chill prickled his neck despite the heat. The bayou's edge was closer than he liked, its murky waters whispering secrets through the reeds. Folks in town spoke of the old Treadwell curse, tied to the land his grandfather had claimed after the Indian removal, shadows of the displaced walking ahead, marking the path to ruin. He dismissed it as superstition, but the boy's letters from the tutor in Little Rock had arrived empty, pages blank as if the ink had bled away. And now, with the cotton wilting under an unnatural blight, black veins creeping through the bowls like fingers clutching at life. Doubt gnawed at him. He straightened, resolve hardening his jaw. No more waiting. He'd fetch the lantern oil from the shed and search the attic for that tarnished silver cross his father swore warded off the dark. But as he turned toward the house, a shadow flitted across the dirt path, long, elongated, belonging to no man or beast he could see. It paused, as if waiting, then slithered toward the porch steps. Thomas heard the door latch rattle before Caleb did. They froze, the sage ash still gritty under their bare feet. Pause back early, Caleb breathed, but the sound came again, softer, insistent, like knuckles on wood from within. The shadow by the table stretched, thinning into a line that snaked toward the stairs. Thomas grabbed his brother's arm, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. It's not Pa. It's them, the ones ahead. Upstairs, in the dim hallway where dust motes danced like lost souls, the air grew colder. The boys' room, with its shared trundled bed and walls papered in faded maps of the territories, held its own secrets. Caleb had hidden a knife there, pilfered from the kitchen, its blade dull but reassuring. They crept up together, footsteps muffled on the worn rugs, the house groaning around them like a living thing. At the landing, the shadow waited. Elias's, perhaps, cast from below, but twisted, with edges that frayed into tendrils. Elias burst through the front door moments later, lantern in hand, the oil sloshing against the glass. Boys! His call echoed, unanswered. The parlor was empty, the sage bundles smoldering in the grate. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, his boots thudding against the wood, each step echoing the dread coiling in his gut. The attic hatch yawned open above, a black maw he'd sworn he'd nailed shut last fall. In the boys' room, Thomas and Caleb pressed against the wall, the knife trembling in Caleb's grip. The shadow coalesced, forming a silhouette that mimicked their father. Broad shoulders, stooped posture, but it moved wrong, gliding without sound. It reached for the door, and Thomas stifled a cry as the first real touch came, cold, like mist off the bayou, seeping through the cracks. Elias shoved the door open, the cross clutched in his fist, its silver gleaming faintly. "Get back!" he roared, but the shadow dissolved, scattering like smoke, only to reform behind him in the mirror's reflection. The boys rushed forward, piling into his arms, their faces pale as moonlight. The plan had backfired. The sage had drawn it closer, not repelled it. Now, with the sun, Elias Treadwell wiped the sweat from his brow, the midday sun beating down on the cotton fields like a hammer on an anvil. The air hung thick with the scent of earth and distant rain, but it did little to ease the knot in his gut. His sons, Caleb and young Amos, had vanished into the tree line at dawn, chasing what they swore were shadows, elongated figures that moved with purpose, just beyond the farm's edge. Now, as the hours stretched, Elias gripped his rifle tighter, the wood slick against his calloused palms. He told them to stay close, but boys that age chase trouble like hounds after fox. Mary, his wife, paced the porch behind him, her skirts whispering against the warped boards. "They'll come back when hunger calls," she said, but her voice cracked, betraying the fear she tried to bury. The shadows had started a week ago, faint at first, like tricks of the light during harvest. Then the whispers began, soft murmurs in the night that sounded like the boys' laughter, echoing from empty rooms. Pushing through the underbrush, Elias followed the faint trail they'd left, broken twigs, a scuffed boot print in the mud. The forest closed in, oaks twisting overhead like gnarled fingers. He called their names, his voice swallowed by the rustle of leaves. No answer, just the steady thump of his heart, quickening with each step. Ahead, the path narrowed to a creek bed, water murmuring over smooth stones. That's when he saw it, a shadow, long and wavering, detached from any tree or bush. It stretched across the water, humanoid, as if waiting. Elias froze, rifle raised. The shadow shifted, not with the wind, but deliberately, turning toward him. It was Caleb's shape, unmistakable, the slight hunch from a fall last spring, the way one arm hung looser than the other. But there was no boy attached to it. A chill slithered down his spine, colder than the creek spray. "Caleb," he whispered, stepping closer. The shadow recoiled, then darted upstream, silent as smoke. He splashed through the water, boots sinking into the silt, cursing under his breath. This wasn't right. Shadows didn't run. By the time he crested the bank, the figure had vanished into a thicket of brambles. Elias hacked at the vines with his knife, thorns snagging his sleeves like eager hands. Blood welled on his forearm, but he pressed on, the metallic tang mixing with the damp rot of the woods. Deeper in, the trees thinned, opening to a clearing ringed by moss-draped stones. Old, like something from the Indian times, before white folks claimed the land. In the center stood Amos, or what looked like him. The boy knelt, hands buried in the soil, digging with frantic energy. But his shadow loomed behind, twice his size, arms outstretched as if pulling something from the earth. "Amos!" Elias shouted, lunging forward. The boy jerked up, dirt-streaked face pale, eyes wide with a terror that mirrored his father's. "Pa, it's them, the shadows. They called us here." Before Elias could reach him, the shadow twisted, coiling around the boy like rope. Amos gasped, clawing at the air, but his body went rigid, eyes rolling back. Elias fired the rifle into the shade, the crack echoing like thunder. Wood splintered from a nearby stump, but the shadow only rippled, then surged toward him. It felt like ice against his skin as it brushed past, dragging a whisper, "Follow." He stumbled back, heart pounding, as Amos slumped to the ground, unharmed but limp, breath shallow. Mary's voice cut through from the tree-line. She'd followed after all, her lantern swinging wildly. "Elias, what devilry is this?" She rushed to Amos, cradling his head, while Elias scanned the clearing. Two more shadows flickered at the edges now, converging on Caleb's distant form, half hidden in the ferns. The plan to fetch the preacher from town, to burn sage and pray it away, shattered in that moment. This wasn't sin or a fever dream. It was alive, hungry, pulling their boys into the dark. As dusk bled into the sky, Elias hoisted Amos over his shoulder, Mary supporting from behind. The shadows trailed them, silent sentinels, their edges blurring with the fading light. Back at the farm, the lanterns would burn all night, but Elias knew the cost. Whatever walked ahead now owned pieces of his sons, and the whispers would grow louder before they stopped. Elias Treadwell gripped the reins tighter as the wagon lurched over the rutted path, the Arkansas mud sucking at the wheels like a living thing. Dawn's gray light filtered through the pines, casting long shadows that twisted across the trail ahead. His youngest son, Caleb, huddled beside him on the bench, his small hands clutching a worn blanket, eyes fixed on those same shadows as if they might reach out and pull him under. Behind them, the family's mule brayed softly, hauling the last of their belongings from the homestead they'd abandoned in the night. Mary, Elias's wife, walked alongside, her skirts muddied to the knees, one arm steadying their elder boy, Jonah, who limped from a twisted ankle sustained in the hasty flight. The whispers had driven them out, those faint echoes that mimicked the boys' voices, calling from the empty rooms of the cabin. At first, Elias had dismissed them as wind through the eaves or the creak of settling timbers, but last night, when Jonah's shadow detached from his feet and slithered toward the door like spilled ink, they could ignore it no more. The family had packed what they could carry, fleeing toward the river town of Van Buren, where Elias hoped a preacher or a doctor might make sense of the curse that seemed to cling to their sons like damp rot. Caleb shifted, his voice a thin thread in the morning chill. "Pa, they're still there. Look." He pointed ahead, where the path dipped into a hollow ringed by gnarled oaks. Shadows pooled unnaturally deep in the underbrush, not the boy's own, but something akin, elongated forms that flickered without a source, murmuring words too soft to catch. Elias swallowed hard, his throat dry as sawdust. He'd told himself it was exhaustion playing tricks, that the fever Caleb had shaken off a fortnight ago had left them all seeing phantoms. But Jonah's limp worsened with each step, the boy muttering about cold fingers trailing his spine. "Keep moving," Elias said, his voice steady for their sake. "We'll ford the creek by noon and be in town before dark." Mary glanced back, her face pale beneath the brim of her bonnet. She'd been the first to notice, weeks ago, how the boys' shadows lingered after sunset, stretching toward the fields as if beckoning something unseen. Now, as the wagon crested the hollow's edge, a low fog rolled in from the creek bed, carrying the scent of wet earth and decay. The mule snorted, ears flattening, and refused to budge. "Easy now," Elias coaxed, hopping down to unhitch the beast. His boots sank into the muck, and he felt it then, a subtle pull, like the ground breathing beneath him. Jonah cried out from the wagon's rear, his shadow detaching once more, this time coiling around the wheel like a serpent before snapping back to his heels with a wet smack. Mary rushed to her son's side, pulling him close. "It's nothing, love. Just the light." But her eyes met Elias's over the boy's head, wide with the lie they both knew. Caleb climbed down unbidden, staring into the fog. "They're saying our names, Ma. Listen." The air hummed faintly, a chorus of echoes. Calibi, Jonah, drawn out like a dirge. Elias's blood ran cold. He'd heard tales from old trappers about spirits bound to the land, restless souls from the Cherokee removals or forgotten skirmishes, latching onto the living like burrs. He grabbed the mule's bridle, yanking it forward, but the animal planted its hooves, eyes rolling white. A plan formed in the panic, bypassed the creek, cut through the thicket to the north, where the ground rose dry. "Mary, get the boys down. We'll lead it on foot." She nodded, herding them ahead, but as they pushed into the underbrush, the shadows multiplied. Not just the boys now, but Elias's own stretched impossibly, merging with branches that seemed to lean closer, whispering promises of rest, of joining the chorus. Jonah stumbled, falling to his knees in a patch of brambles. His shadow pooled around him, darkening the soil until it looked like an open grave. "Pa, it hurts," he gasped, clawing at his leg where no wound showed, only the pallor of something leaching his warmth. Elias dropped to haul him up, thorns tearing his palms. The fog thickened, voices rising in urgency, names, pleas, fragments of laughter from the boy's childhood. Caleb froze ahead, pointing. "There, it's them. Our shadows walking." Ahead, twin shapes emerged from the mist, boy-sized silhouettes gliding without sound, heads turned back as if waiting. They weren't reflections. These moved independently, beckoning with elongated arms. Mary's breath hitched, and she clutched Caleb's hand, pulling him back. "Elias, we can't." But the shadows turned fully then, faces hollow but familiar, mouths opening in silent invitation. The mule bolted suddenly, dragging the wagon into the thicket with a splintering crash. Branches whipped at them as Elias lunged for the boys, the ground tilting under an unseen force. The whispers swelled to a roar, pulling at their heels, and in that moment, Elias realized the flight had only drawn them deeper into the hollow's embrace. They broke through to a small clearing, the wagon overturned, supplies scattered like broken bones. The shadows encircled them now, closing the ring, and Jonah's form began to blur at the edges, his eyes glazing as if sleep claimed him forever. Elias shoved the family behind him, snatching a fallen branch as a makeshift club, heart pounding against the dread that their son's shades weren't fleeing. They were leading the way home. Elias gripped the lantern tighter, its flame flickering like a heartbeat against the damp walls of the root cellar. The air down here hung heavy with the scent of turned earth and something sharper, like wet iron. He'd come alone this time, leaving Mary upstairs with the shotgun across her lap, her eyes hollowed by the endless watching. The boys' shadows had started appearing at dusk again, longer than they should be, stretching from the empty corners of the cabin toward the fields where the cotton bolls hung unpicked, ghostly white in the moonlight. He wedged the lantern on a shelf of jars, their contents murky as forgotten sins, and knelt by the trapdoor at the far end, the one that led deeper under the hill. It had been boarded up since the fever took the twins last harvest, but the nails had worked loose, as if pried by invisible fingers. Elias's hands shook as he pulled the first plank free, the wood splintering softly. "Just checking," he muttered to the darkness, though he knew it listened. The shadows never spoke, but they moved with purpose, always ahead, leading the family toward some unseen edge. A draft whispered up from below, carrying the faint echo of laughter, high and brittle, like the boys when they'd chased fireflies. Elias froze, his breath catching. He wasn't imagining it. The sound bounced off the stones, pulling at him. Against every instinct screaming to seal it back up, he descended the ladder, each rung groaning under his weight. The lantern light barely pierced the gloom, revealing a tunnel that shouldn't exist, carved rough through the clay, veined with roots that twisted like veins. At the end, maybe 20 paces in, the passage widened into a chamber. Elias's boots scraped something soft, cloth, he realized, dropping to his knees. It was one of the boys' shirts, the blue one Jacob had worn, soiled and torn as if dragged through thorns. Beside it lay a small boot, caked in mud, its lace untied. The shadows pooled here, thicker, forming vague shapes that shifted when he blinked. One elongated arm reached toward him, not touching, but beckoning, as if to say, follow, paw. We've been waiting. Sweat beaded on Elias's brow despite the chill. He thought of Mary, her fingers twisting the quilt until the threads frayed, whispering prayers that grew thinner each night. The farm was dying around them. The well water turned brackish, the livestock found with eyes glazed and throats unmarked. If he turned back now, the shadows would only creep closer to the house, slipping under doors, across floorboards. But going deeper, that was surrender. He pressed on, the lantern swinging, casting wild arcs that made the walls pulse. The laughter returned, closer, mingled with a low murmur, like voices overlapping in the wind. Elias's heart hammered, each step a betrayal of the life he'd built, the plow in the barn, the marriage bed warmed by promises. Ahead, the tunnel narrowed again, forcing him to stoop, his shoulders brushing the earth. Something skittered in the dark beyond the light, small feet pattering away. Then, a shape solidified, not shadow, but silhouette, the outline of a boy standing at the fork. It turned its head, no face, just void, but Elias knew it was Samuel, the bolder twin, always leading Jacob into mischief. The figure didn't move, but the pull was there, an invisible thread tugging at Elias's chest. He reached out, fingers trembling, and touched nothing but air that tasted of regret. From above, muffled through the layers of soil, came Mary's voice, sharp, calling his name. Panic surged. Had the shadows reached her? Elias spun, scrambling back, but the ladder seemed farther now, the rungs slick. As he climbed, the laughter followed, fading into a sigh that echoed in his bones. He burst into the cellar, slamming the trapdoor and nailing it shut with frantic blows of his hammer, each strike a vow to end this. Upstairs, Mary waited, her face pale as the bulls outside. "They're in the yard again," she said, nodding toward the window. Elias looked, and there they were, two slender forms darting between the trees, their shadows cast long and ahead, vanishing into the tree-line as if guiding the way to whatever hell awaited next. He pulled her close, the shotgun cold against his side, knowing the night had only begun its unraveling. Elias Treadwell gripped the shotgun tighter, its barrel cold against his sweat-slicked palm, as the lanterns flickered through jagged shadows across the barn's weathered beams. The air hung thick with the scent of damp hay and something sharper, like scorched earth after a lightning strike. His youngest son, Caleb, huddled beside him, eyes wide but unblinking, the boy's fingers twisting the hem of his nightshirt. Outside, the wind howled through the Arkansas pines, carrying whispers that sounded too much like laughter, low, mocking, from lips that weren't there. They'd barricaded the doors hours ago, after the shadows first slithered in from the fields. Not the ordinary kind that stretched with the sun, but these, darker, denser, moving on their own. Elias had seen them first near the creek, twin shapes darting ahead of Amos and Caleb as the boys fetched water. At dusk, the shadows hadn't retreated. They'd lingered, peeled away like smoke, and circled the house. Now, with midnight pressing in, Elias wondered if the fever that took his wife last spring had been the start of it all, a curse woven into the land they'd claimed from the river's edge. A scrape echoed from the loft above, deliberate, like nails on wood. Caleb flinched, pressing closer to his father's leg. "Pa, it's them again. Amos's and mine. Walkin' without us." Elias shushed him gently, raising the lantern higher. The light caught motes of dust swirling in unnatural patterns, forming outlines that mimicked small shoulders, bowed heads. He remembered the old tales from his pa, back in Tennessee, shadows as harbingers, souls untethered in the wild woods. But this was no folktale. The farmhands had fled 2 nights prior, muttering of eyes in the dark. Elias couldn't afford to lose the boys, not with the war brewing and creditors circling like vultures. He edged toward the ladder, boots creaking on the floorboards. "Stay put, Caleb. If it's just raccoons, or wind, I'll scare 'em off." But his voice cracked, betraying the lie. The shadows had grown bolder since supper, slipping under the door cracks, pooling at their feet like spilled ink. Amos, the elder, was upstairs in the house with their ma's old Bible, reciting verses that did nothing to hold them back. Another sound, closer now, a soft patter, like bare feet on straw. Elias climbed the ladder one rung at a time, heart thudding against his ribs. The loft smelled of mildew and forgotten harvests, bales stacked haphazardly where the boys used to play. His lantern swept the space, illuminating cobwebs that trembled as if breathing. There, in the corner, a shape detached from the wall, small, humanoid, edges blurring into the gloom. It turned, no face, just void, and extended a hand that wavered like heat haze. Elias froze, the shotgun's stock digging into his shoulder. "Amos? Caleb? That you boys foolin' me?" But the figure didn't answer. It glided forward, silent, mimicking the way his sons walked. Amos's confident stride, Caleb's hesitant shuffle, merged into one eerie mimicry. The shadow reached out, fingers brushing the air inches from his boot, and Elias felt a chill seep through his clothes, numbing his skin. Down below, Caleb's voice rose in a whimper. "Pa, it's comin' down." Elias whipped around, the lantern swinging wildly. The loft shadows were spilling over the edge, cascading like black water toward the ladder. He fired the shotgun into the dark, the blast deafening, powder smoke curling up to join the fray. Wood splintered, but the shadows only rippled, reforming faster, hungrier. He scrambled down, grabbing Caleb's arm and yanking him toward the side door. "Run for the house. Wake your brother." The boy nodded, terror etching lines on his young face, and bolted into the night. Elias followed, the shadows nipping at his heels, stretching long across the yard under the moon's pale gaze. The creek murmured nearby, its waters dark and still, as if waiting. Inside the house, Amos met them at the threshold, a kerosene lamp in one hand, the Bible clutched in the other. His face was pale, freckles stark against his skin. "Pa, they's in the walls now, scratchin' to get out." The room felt smaller, corners deepened, and Elias could see them. Faint outlines pacing behind the wallpaper, shadows of sons who stood right there, flesh and blood, but somehow lesser in their presence. Elias barred the door, his breath ragged. The family huddled by the hearth, flames leaping but offering no warmth against the encroaching cold. Outside, the pines rustled, and the shadows gathered at the windows, pressing in, their forms twisting into familiar poses, a boy reaching for a fishing pole, another chasing fireflies. But these weren't memories. They were claims, pulling at the edges of the living. "We can't stay," Elias muttered, loading the second barrel. "The river's risin' with the rains. Maybe the current'll wash 'em away." Amos shook his head, voice steady despite the fear. "No, Pa. They's tied to us. To the land Ma loved." Caleb nodded faintly, his small hand finding his brother's. The scratching intensified, vibrating through the floorboards. Elias glanced at his sons, their real shadows flickering innocently by the fire, for now. He knew the cost. Leaving meant abandoning the farm, the life they'd built on blood and sweat. But staying? That would mean watching the shadows claim what was left of their family, one elongated step at a time. As the first crack appeared in the window glass, spiderwebbing like veins, Elias made the air down here was thick, laced with the rot of forgotten potatoes and something sharper, earth turned over too many times. He'd come alone this time, leaving Ma and the girls upstairs with their rifles loaded, their barrels pointed at shadows that weren't there. Or weren't supposed to be. The son's whispers had grown louder since dawn, not words exactly, but echoes of laughter from boys who hadn't laughed in years. "Pa," one had seemed to say, pulling him down these creaking steps. He knelt by the far wall, where the dirt floor met stone foundation, and dug with his bare hands. The soil gave way easily, as if it had been waiting. Last night, under the harvest moon that bled red through the clouds, he'd seen them again, Tom and little Ben, their forms blurred at the edges, stepping ahead into the cornfield like they were leading him somewhere. Not chasing, no, guiding, with that patient pull that twisted his gut. The war had taken them at Shiloh, or so the letter said, but Elias knew better now. They hadn't gone far. Just deep enough to wait. A clod of earth crumbled, revealing the glint of metal. His old army-issue knife, the one he'd given Tom before the boy marched off. It lay there clean, no rust, as if buried yesterday. Elias's fingers closed around the handle, and for a moment, the lantern light bent, stretching shadows across the ceiling like fingers reaching back. He froze. Footsteps overhead, soft, too light for Ma's boots. The girls were supposed to be locked in the loft, but whispers carried down. "Pa? You finned in them?" "Not yet," he muttered, voice rough as gravel. But he had. Or part of them. The knife warmed in his palm, unnaturally so, and he pressed it against the wall, tracing the cracks that hadn't been there before. They spidered out, following the line where the cellar ended and something older began, a seam in the stone, hidden under the house they'd built with their own sweat 20 years back. Arkansas clay, they called it, but it held secrets thicker than blood. The whispers shifted, closer now, not from above, but from the wall itself. Elias leaned in, ear to the cold surface, and heard it, a child's voice, Ben's, murmuring about the river. The Arkansas ran black at night, they said, swallowing what the floods left behind. But the boys had drowned there first, in the spring swell before the war called. No, that was the lie they'd told themselves. Elias remembered the fever, the way Tom had clutched the quilt, eyes glassy, begging for water that turned to mud in his throat. Ben followed 2 nights later, silent as a shadow slipping away. He wedged the knife into the seam, prying with all his weight. Stone grated against stone, a low groan that vibrated through his bones. Dust sifted down, coating his tongue with the taste of chalk and regret. Behind a gap, darkness yawned, not empty, but alive, pulsing with a faint outline of 2 small figures, their backs to him, heads bowed as if praying. Or waiting. Elias's breath caught. "Boys." The word escaped, barely a sound, but the shadows stirred, turning slowly, faces half formed in the gloom. Upstairs, a scream pierced the quiet, Ma's, sharp and final. The lantern sputtered, and Elias lunged forward, knife first, into the dark that his sons had carved for him. The wall gave way like flesh parting, and he fell through, the world tilting into whispers that finally spoke his name. Elias gripped the lantern's handle until his knuckles ached, the flame inside flickering like a heartbeat on the verge of quitting. The cabin's walls seemed to lean in closer now, the rough-hewn logs whispering with every draft from the storm outside. Rain hammered the roof, relentless drum that drowned out the wind's howl, but it couldn't mask the soft scuffing sounds from the floorboards beneath their feet. The shadows, the boys' shadows, had grown bolder since dusk, stretching long and thin across the room, as if the darkness itself was learning to walk. Martha sat huddled by the hearth, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, though the fire did little to warm the chill that had settled in her bones. She rocked slowly, her eyes fixed on the empty corner where the cradle used to sit, before the fever took the little ones. "They're close," she murmured, her voice barely rising above the rain. "I can feel 'em pullin' at the edges." Elias shot her a glance, wanting to argue, to tell her it was just the storm playing tricks, but the words stuck in his throat. He'd seen it too, the way the shadows twisted, not like mere absence of light, but like fingers reaching out. He set the lantern down on the scarred oak table and knelt by the trapdoor in the floor, the one leading to the root cellar. His hands trembled as he pried at the iron ring, the wood groaning in protest. "We can't stay up here," he said, more to himself than to her. "If we get below, maybe the light will hold 'em off till morning." Martha nodded, but her face was pale, etched with lines that hadn't been there a month ago, when the boys were still alive, laughing in the yard with their stick horses and muddy boots. The shadows had started then, faint at first, trailing behind the lads like playful echoes. Now, with the boys buried under the oak out back, those echoes had turned hungry. As the trapdoor creaked open, a gust of damp air rose from below, carrying the earthy scent of potatoes and regret. Elias lowered the lantern first, its glow revealing the cramped space, shelves lined with jars of preserves, a few sacks of flour, and the shadows pooling in the corners like spilled ink. He helped Martha down the short ladder, her skirts brushing against the rungs, and for a moment, as her feet touched the dirt floor, the scuffing stopped. Silence, thick and waiting, wrapped around them. But it didn't last. From upstairs came a soft thud, like bare feet padding across the boards. Elias froze, his hand on Martha's arm. "Boys," she whispered, her voice breaking. He shook his head sharply, pulling her toward the back wall where he'd piled old blankets for a makeshift bed. They sank down together, the lantern between them casting jagged light that danced on the walls. The shadows down here were different, thicker, almost velvety, curling at the edges as if testing the boundaries of the light. Elias pulled a small Bible from his pocket, the one his pa had given him before the war pulled him away. He flipped it open, not to read, but to hold it like a shield, the pages yellowed and worn. "Lord, keep us," he muttered, the words tumbling out half-formed. Martha leaned against him, her breath ragged. Up above, the footsteps circled, slow and deliberate, pausing at the trapdoor. A faint scratching followed, like nails on wood, and Elias's heart pounded in his ears. He imagined the shadows slipping through the cracks, seeping down like smoke, wrapping around their ankles. The lantern sputtered then, the flame dipping low, and in that instant of dimness, he saw it, a silhouette, boy-sized, hovering at the ladder's edge. Not quite solid, but enough to block the light, its edges fraying into wisps. Martha gasped, clutching his sleeve. "Elias, it's Tommy," she said, tears carving tracks down her dirt-streaked cheeks. The shadow tilted its head, as if listening, and the air grew colder, the kind of cold that sank into the marrow. He blew gently on the lantern wick, coaxing the flame brighter, and the shadow recoiled, melting back into the gloom. But the scratching resumed, insistent now, joined by a second set of footsteps, lighter, like little Ben's. Elias pressed the Bible to his chest, his mind racing. They'd tried everything, prayers at dawn, salt lines across the thresholds, even burning sage from the trader's post. Nothing held the shadows at bay for long. The boys wanted them, or so the whispers suggested in the night, wanted their ma and pa to follow, to walk ahead into whatever waited beyond the veil. As the night wore on, the storm raged fiercer, lightning flashing through the cellar's small vent, illuminating the shadows in stark bursts. They gathered at the edges now, a dozen tendrils probing the light's fringe, patient as hunters. Martha's rocking slowed, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but Elias stayed vigilant, whispering promises to the dark. Dawn was hours away, and with it, perhaps a chance to bury the shadows for good or join them. The choice loomed, heavy as the rain-soaked earth outside. The lantern's flame guttered in the damp wind, casting jagged shadows that clawed at the walls of the old barn. Elias Treadwell crouched by the trapdoor, his hands raw from prying at the rusted hinges, while his brother Caleb pressed his ear to the splintered wood below. The air hung heavy with the scent of wet earth and something sharper, like singed hair. They'd come this far, chasing whispers that weren't their own, and now the shadows, the boys' shadows, twisted echoes of Samuel and young Thomas, seemed to thicken around them, pulling at the edges of their vision. "They're down there," Caleb murmured, his voice a threadbare whisper. He was the cautious one, always had been, but fear had stripped that caution to bone. "I hear 'em, like footsteps in mud, but wrong." Elias nodded, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. Brave to a fault, he'd led them through the flooded fields and the whispering woods, but bravery felt like a fraying rope now. The family curse, or whatever it was, those shadows that walked ahead, luring the Treadwell sons into the dark, had claimed their brothers years ago, back when the war's drumbeat still echoed from the rivers. Samuel had vanished first, chasing a silhouette into the canebrake. Thomas followed, swearing he saw Pa's old hat bobbing in the mist. Now, with the farm crumbling under debt and fever, the shadows had turned back to Elias and Caleb, hungry for the last of the line. He wedged the crowbar deeper, muscles straining. A hinge screamed free, then another. The trapdoor creaked open, revealing a maw of blackness that exhaled cold breath upward. Something stirred below, a soft scrape, like nails on stone. Caleb recoiled, his lantern hand trembling, but Elias grabbed his arm. "We end this tonight. For Ma. For all of us." They descended the ladder one rung at a time, the wood groaning under their weight. The basement stretched into a root cellar carved from the hillside, its walls slick with moss and older stains. At the far end, where the lantern light frayed into nothing, the shadows coalesced. Not mere absence of light, but forms, two slender figures, elongated and wavering, their outlines mimicking Samuel's lanky stride and Thomas's boyish hunch. They didn't turn, didn't beckon, just moved, as if leading the brothers deeper into the earth. Caleb's breath hitched. "Samuel? That you?" The nearer shadow paused, its edges rippling like water disturbed by a stone. A voice slithered up from the dark, not Samuel's, but an imitation, hollow and layered. "Come see what we found, brother. The river's full of secrets." Elias's heart pounded, a drum in his chest. He remembered the stories Pa told before the drink took him. The land here was old, soaked in blood from Cherokee trails and slave chases, binding the restless to those who stayed too long. The shadows weren't ghosts, not exactly. They were the farm's memory, feeding on the Treadwell's grief, growing bolder with each lost son. To break it, they had to face it, not flee. He stepped forward, pulling Caleb along. "We ain't following no more. You hear? This ends." The shadows shifted, splitting and reforming, their movements syncing with the drip of water from the ceiling. One reached out, a hand that wasn't flesh, just void, and brushed Elias's sleeve. Cold seeped into his skin, visions flashing. Samuel's face twisted in the underbrush, Thomas's small body swallowed by the Arkansas mud. Elias staggered, but Caleb steadied him, his voice rising sharp. "No. You took 'em, but you don't get us." Caleb swung the lantern like a flail, its light slashing across the forms. The shadows recoiled, hissing, a sound like wind through cracked bones. Emboldened, Elias drew the knife from his belt, the one Pa had used to carve their initials into the barn beam. He slashed at the air, not to cut flesh, but to sever the pull. Together, they advanced, chanting the old words Ma had whispered in delirium, prayers mixed with native chants stolen from the woods. The shadows writhed, their outlines fraying at the edges. Samuel's form lunged, but Caleb met it with a shove, his cautious hands now fists. "Go back. We bury you here." The air thickened, pressure building like a storm about to break. Elias plunged the knife into the heart of the larger shadow, twisting it as if carving a boundary. A wail echoed, not human, splitting the damp stone. The form shuddered, collapsing inward, sucked into the cracks of the earth like smoke down a chimney. Silence fell, broken only by their ragged breaths. They climbed out as dawn grayed the sky, the barn door swinging wide to the empty fields. The shadows were gone. No more dark scouts ahead on the path. But as Elias glanced back, he saw it, a faint trace on the threshold, like boot prints in dew, leading away into the mist. Caleb noticed too, his face paling. "It's over," Elias said, but his voice lacked conviction. The farm would heal, the debt perhaps paid with this night's work, but the land remembered. And in quiet moments, when the wind sighed through the cane, they'd feel it, the Treadwell sun's shadows, not walking ahead, but waiting, patient as the river.